Hello. Welcome to Chapter 8, Unit 7 for HS 120 Anatomy and Physiology 1. This presentation is going to describe or explain all about the nervous system. There are two main divisions of the nervous system. They are the central nervous system, or CNS, that contains the brain and the spinal cord, and then all the other nerves in the body are part of the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. We then can also break down another system or another division of the nervous system into what is called the autonomic nervous system, and this includes the sympathetic and parasympathetic. If we look at this table, we can see that this is the table that is in the textbook. This does break down the two main divisions, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and the structures that comprise those divisions. The central nervous system, as we said, is the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system are all other nerves, such as the cranial nerves that are in the brain and the spinal nerves. We then also can have the autonomic or involuntary motor nerves, the somatic voluntary motor nerves, and then finally the nerves that are sensory. The cell of the nervous system is called a neuron, and there's three main parts to the neuron: the dendrite, the cell body, and the axon. If you look in figure 8.2 in your textbook or your e-text, you can see these three parts. We can also see these three parts, for example, on this image here in the PowerPoint. This is very important to know, is that dendrites conduct impulses to the cell body of the neuron. The cell body is where we will find also the nucleus. The axons, which look like a tail, are going to conduct impulses away from the cell body of the neuron. And the way to remember this is I always remember it as axons away, AA. Neurons can be classified according to their function. They're either sensory, motor, or they can be called interneurons. Sensory neurons are also called afferent, and these will conduct impulses to the spinal cord and the brain, whereas the motor or efferent neurons will conduct impulses away from the brain and to the spinal cord, away from the brain and the spinal cord, to such areas as the muscles and glands. The interneurons, inter meaning between, are going to conduct impulses from a sensory neuron to a motor neuron. So the example that I like to give in describing how these neurons work is, imagine that you are making dinner and you go to touch the handle of a pot. When you touch the handle of that pot, it's hot. But in order to determine that it's hot and that you need to pull your hand away, the sensory neurons are going to conduct, that are in your hands, are going to conduct impulses up the arm, then to the spinal cord, to then the brain, where the brain's going to determine, hey, this pot's really hot. And then that signal is then going to go from the brain down to the motor or efferent neurons, all the way back down through the spinal cord, down into your arm, to tell those muscles in your hand and in your arm to remove your hand off of that hot pot. I also tell students that to remember that sensory is also called afferent, or motor is also called efferent, is to just remember SA or SA and ME or me. This is one picture that shows you the neuron. You can see, some students call it, looks like a tree, with the top of the tree and the branches being the dendrites and the cell body. The dendrites look like little finger or hair-like projections. And again, we can see the cell body contains the nucleus. We then have the tail part, or what would be the main part of the tree would be the axon. And in this picture, you can see that the purple covering along the axon is called myelin sheath, and we'll talk about that momentarily. And then finally, we have the end of the axon is the axon terminal button. And this is where one neuron is going to connect to another neuron, and we're going to have the neurotransmitters released off of this axon terminal button to then jump across the presynaptic neuron, across the synaptic cleft, to then the postsynaptic neuron. But we'll also talk about that. Other cells of the nervous system are called glia or neuroglia. These are nothing other than support cells that bring the cells of the nervous tissue together both structurally and functionally. There's three main types, and these are in the central nervous system, these three types. They are astrocytes, microglia, and oligodendrocytes. The type of glia cell that's found in the peripheral nervous system are called Schwann cells, kind of like the Schwann trucks that would go and deliver food to people. But what these Schwann cells do is that they're going to form the myelin sheaths that are found on the axons of the neurons of the PNS. If we look at a nerve is nothing other than a bundle of peripheral axons. We have what is called a tract, which is a bundle of central axons, and sometimes we may hear terms such as white matter and gray matter. White matter is nothing other than any nervous tissue that's made up mainly of myelinated axons, which, remember the previous picture that I showed, the purple covering over the axon? That was the myelin. If there is no myelin, we then have it called gray matter. Gray matter is tissue that's composed primarily of cell bodies and unmyelinated fibers. Just as with the skin, and you'll learn in part 2 of this course with the blood vessels, there are layers or coverings. The nerve coverings are made up of fibrous connective tissue. These layers that is demonstrated here are going from the inside out. The innermost nerve covering is called the endoneurium, which surrounds an individual fiber within the nerve. We then go to the middle nerve covering that surrounds a group of nerve fibers, and that is called the perineurium. The outermost nerve covering that surrounds the entire nerve is called the epineurium. So as I remind students, think of epidermis, the epidermal layer of the skin, which is the outermost layer, the part that we can touch. So in this case with the nerve covering, the epineurium is the outermost layer. Nerve impulses are nothing other than self-propagating waves of electrical disturbance that travel along the surface of a neuron membrane. What happens is that some stimulus triggers the opening of Na-positive channels in the plasma membrane of the neuron. We then get an inward movement of positive sodium ions that leaves a slight excess of the negative ions outside at a stimulated point. And this then marks the beginning of the nerve impulse. So for example, a stimulus would be when you're touching that hot pot. We have then a synapse. The synapse is nothing but chemical compounds that are released from the axon terminals of a presynaptic neuron into the synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitters will bind to specific receptor molecules in the membrane of a postsynaptic neuron, which then opens ion channels, stimulating an impulse conduction by the membrane. The names of these neurotransmitters are acetylcholine, catecholamines, norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin are the types of catecholamines, and some other compounds. This is an example right here of the synapse. We can see that the neurotransmitters are in a presynaptic neuron, then transferring over the synaptic cleft to then attach to parts on the postsynaptic neuron. Now that we know about the cells of the nervous system, let's go ahead and talk about the divisions in detail. We said that the central nervous system, or CNS, is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. Well, the brain has various divisions, and if you look in your e-textbook or your textbook, figures 8.9 and table 8.1 explain these. We'll start off first with the brainstem. The brainstem has three parts: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. There's white matter with bits of gray matter scattered throughout the brainstem, and its function is as a reflex center for such functions as heartbeat, respirations, and blood vessel diameter. The sensory tracts within the brainstem conduct impulses to then the higher parts of the brain. And then the motor tracts will conduct the impulses, or what it feels, from those higher parts of the brain to then the spinal cord. The diencephalon is part of the hypothalamus. It's mainly of the posterior pituitary gland, the pituitary stalk, and gray matter. The diencephalon acts as the major center for controlling the autonomic nervous system, so it helps control the functioning of most of our internal organs. You'll learn in the endocrine system also that it controls hormone secretion by the anterior and the posterior pituitary glands. So it does indirectly help control hormone secretion by most other endocrine glands as well. We also have where the centers for controlling body temperature, appetite, wakefulness, and pleasure are contained here. The thalamus is a dumbbell-shaped mass of gray matter in each of the cerebral hemispheres. They relay sensory impulses to cerebral cortex sensory areas, and in some way they produce emotions of pleasantness or unpleasantness that's associated with sensations. So the diencephalon, again, is another part of the brain that has the hypothalamus and the thalamus. The cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain. It is found toward the posterior side of the brain and helps control muscle contractions to produce coordinated movements so that way we can maintain balance, move smoothly, and maintain our normal posture. The next division of the brain I like to remember from Cerebro, if you've ever watched X-Men. Cerebro was the device that was placed on top of Professor Xavier's head for him to be able to determine where other mutants were. So the cerebrum is going to be the part of the brain, which is the largest part of the brain, but includes like the top of the head, the front, and the side. The outer layer of the cerebrum is gray matter, and we call that the cerebral cortex. It is also made up of lobes that is made up mostly of dendrites and cell bodies. The inside of the cerebrum is made up mostly of white matter. And the function of this cerebrum includes mental processes of all types such as sensations, consciousness, memory, and voluntary control of movements. And here's just a quick picture of what Cerebro from X-Men looks like. This picture can also be found in your textbook or your e-text, and I highly encourage you to refer to these pictures as you're reading about the different divisions of the brain. Finally, we have the spinal cord. The spinal cord is encased around the vertebral column. The outer part is made up of white matter, and the interior part is made up of gray matter. It functions as the center for all spinal cord reflexes. Sensory tracts will conduct impulses to the brain, and then once the sensation is perceived, the motor tracts then conduct impulses from the brain. We also have coverings and fluid spaces. The coverings include, of course, the bones of the cranium and vertebrae. And then we have cerebral and spinal meninges that include the dura mater, the pia mater, and the arachnoid mater. The spaces are known as the subarachnoid spaces of the meninges, the central canal, which is inside the spinal cord, and then finally the ventricles in the brain. And again, in reviewing these structures, I recommend that you refer to your e-textbook or textbook at the diagrams. Going on to the second division, the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, this is going to encompass our cranial nerves of the brain and our spinal nerves. We have 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and when we say 12 pairs, that should be a total of 24. They connect the brain with the neck and structures in the thorax and, of course, the abdomen. Our spinal nerves contain dendrites of sensory neurons and axons of motor neurons. The purpose of the spinal nerves are to conduct impulses that are necessary for sensations and voluntary movements, in other words, movements that we can control. In anatomy and physiology, we can always come up with various mnemonics. So here are just some mnemonics for the cranial nerves. Oh, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are heavenly. On old Olympus towering top, a Finn and German viewed some hops. On old Olympus towering top, a friendly Viking grew vine and hops. We also have a mnemonic to know whether the nerve is sensory, motor, or both. So here's one common mnemonic to remember that. Some say marry money, but my brother says big business makes money. So those that are the S are sensory, those that are the M are motor, and the one that's a B is both. So we can link that to then the mnemonic for the 12 cranial nerves up at the top. And this is a great image in your textbook, one of the many great images that show the 12 cranial nerves and what their function or what they affect. The autonomic nervous system are motor neurons that conduct impulses from the CNS to places such as cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glandular epithelial tissue. They regulate the body's automatic or involuntary functions that we cannot control. The autonomic neurons are preganglionic, and they conduct from the spinal cord or brainstem to an autonomic ganglion. The postganglionic neurons also conduct from an autonomic ganglia to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glandular epithelial tissue. We have what are called autonomic or visceral effectors. These are tissues to which the autonomic neurons conduct impulses. So these would be the cardiac, smooth muscle, and glandular epithelial tissue. With the autonomic nervous system, there's two other divisions. That's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic nervous system, the structures include dendrites and cell bodies. What happens in this case is the axons leave the spinal cord in the anterior roots of spinal nerves, and they extend to what's called sympathetic or collateral ganglia, and they synapse with several postganglionic neurons, whose axons then extend to the spinal or autonomic nerves to then finish in the visceral effectors. The function of the sympathetic nervous system is as a fight or flight response. So these serve as the emergency or stress system. So for example, if somebody comes behind you and scares you, the sympathetic division of the nervous system is going to kick in and cause, for example, your heart rate to increase, maybe your blood pressure to go up, maybe for you to start shaking or to start sweating. So we're going to have strong emotions. The parasympathetic division is then going to bring us down back to homeostasis. It's going to work where when our body is able to calm down, it's going to slow our heart rate down, help our breathing, bring our blood pressure back to normal state. We have two kinds of neurotransmitters in the autonomic nervous system. One is cholinergic fibers, and the other is adrenergic fibers. Cholinergic fibers are preganglionic axons of parasympathetic and sympathetic systems and parasympathetic postganglionic axons that release acetylcholine. The adrenergic fibers are going to be axons of sympathetic postganglionic neurons, and what they're going to release is going to be norepinephrine. So the autonomic nervous system as a whole is going to regulate our automatic functions in ways to maintain or restore homeostasis. Many visceral effectors are doubly innervated. So what that means is they receive fibers from parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions and are influenced in opposite ways by the two divisions.